Hi everybody, we're on chapter 32. I'm going to try desperately to finish the story today because I know some of you have been waiting for the end. Okay, so sit back, get comfy, and I'll try and finish it for you. And when full daylight came at last, they all got to their feet and stretched their poor cramped bodies. And then the centipede, who always seemed to see things first, shouted, "Look, there's land below!" "He's right," they cried, running to the edge of the beach and peering over. "Hooray, hooray! It looks like streets and houses. But how enormous it all is!" A vast city, glistening in the early morning sunshine, lay spread out 3,000 feet below them. At that height, the cars were like little beetles crawling along the streets, and people walking on the pavements looked no larger than tiny grains of soot. "But what tremendous tall buildings!" exclaimed the ladybird. "I've never seen anything like them before in England. Which town do you think it is?" "This couldn't possibly be England," said the old green grasshopper. "Then where is it?" said Miss Spider. "You know what those buildings are," shouted James, jumping up and down with excitement. "Those are skyscrapers! So this must be America. And that, my friends, means that we have crossed the Atlantic Ocean overnight." "You don't mean it," they cried. "It's not possible. It's incredible. It's unbelievable." "Oh, I've always dreamed of going to America," cried the centipede. "I had a friend once who—" "Be quiet," cried the earthworm. "Who cares about your friend? The thing we've got to think about now is how on earth are we going to get down to Earth?" "Ask James," said the ladybird. I don't think that should be very difficult," James told them all. "All we'll have to do is cut loose a few seagulls. Not too many, mind you, but just enough so that others can't quite keep us up in the air. Then down we shall go slowly and gently until we reach the ground. Centipede will bite through the strings for us, one at a time." Chapter 33. Far below them in the city of New York, something like pandemonium was breaking out. A great round ball as big as a house had been sighted hovering high up in the sky over the very centre of Manhattan, and the cry had gone up that it was an enormous bomb sent over by another country to blow the whole city to smithereens. Air raid sirens began wailing in every section. All radio and television programs were interrupted with announcements that the population must go down into the cellars immediately. 1 million people walking in the streets on their way to work looked up into the sky and saw the monster hovering above them and started running for the nearest subway entrance to take cover. There we are, we've got the skyscrapers, we've got the giant peach up here. Generals grabbed hold of telephones and shouted orders to everyone they could think of. The mayor of New York called the president of the United States down in Washington, D.C. to ask him for help, and the president, who at that moment was having his breakfast in his pyjamas, quickly pushed away his half-finished plate of sugar crisps and started pressing buttons right and left to summon his admirals and his generals. And all the way across the vast stretch of America, in all the states from Alaska to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, the alarm was sounded, and the word went out that the biggest bomb in history of the world was hovering over New York City, and at any moment it might go off. Chapter 34. "Come on, centipede, bite through the first string," James ordered. The centipede took one of the silk strings between his teeth and bit through it, and once again, but not with an angry cloud man dangling from the end of the string this time, a single seagull came away from the rest of the flock and went flying off on its own. "Bite another," James ordered. The centipede bit through another string. "Why aren't we sinking?" "We are sinking." "No, we're not." "Don't forget the peach is a lot lighter now than when we started out," James told them. "It lost an awful lot of juice when all those hailstones hit it in the night. Cut away 2 more seagulls, centipede." "Ah, that's better. Here we go. Now we're really sinking." "Yes, this is perfect. Don't bite any more, centipede, or we'll sink too fast. Gently does it." Slowly the great peach began losing height, and the buildings and streets below became closer and closer. "Do you think we'll get our pictures in the paper when we get down?" the ladybird asked. "My goodness, I've forgotten to polish my boots," the centipede said. "Everyone must help me to polish my boots before we arrive." "Oh, for heaven's sake," said the earthworm, "can't you ever stop thinking about—" But he never finished the sentence, for suddenly, whoosh! and they looked up and saw a huge 4-engined plane come shooting out of a nearby cloud and go whizzing past them, not more than 20 feet over their heads. This was actually the regular early morning passenger plane coming into New York from Chicago, and as it went by, it sliced right through every single one of the silken strings. And immediately the seagulls broke away, and the enormous peach, having nothing to hold it up in the air any longer, went tumbling down towards the earth like a lump of lead even. "Help!" cried the centipede. "Save us!" cried Miss Spider. "We are lost!" cried the ladybird. "This is the end!" cried the old green grasshopper. "James!" cried the earthworm. "Do something, James! Quickly, do something!" I can't!" cried James. "I'm sorry. Goodbye. Shut your eyes, everyone. It won't be long now." Chapter 35. Round and upside down went the peach as it plummeted towards the earth, and they were all clinging desperately to the stem to save themselves from being flung into space. Faster and faster it fell, down and down and down, racing closer and closer to the houses and streets below, where it would surely smash into 1,000,000 pieces when it hit. And all the way along 5th Avenue and Madison Avenue, and along all the other streets in the city, people who had not yet reached the underground shelters looked up and saw it coming, and they stopped running, and they stood staring in a sort of stupor that they thought that the biggest bomb in the world was about to fall on their heads. A few women screamed. Others knelt down on the sidewalks and began praying aloud. Strong men turned to one another and said things like, "I guess this is it, Joe. And goodbye, everybody, goodbye." And for the next 30 seconds, the whole city held its breath, waiting for the end to come. Chapter 36. "Goodbye, ladybird," gasped James, clinging to the stem of the falling peach. "Goodbye, centipede. Goodbye, everybody." There were only a few seconds to go now, and it looked as though they were going to fall right in amongst the tall buildings. James could see the skyscrapers rushing up to meet them at the most awful speed, and most of them had square, flat tops, but the very tallest of them all had a top that tapered off into a long, sharp point, like an enormous silver needle sticking up into the sky. And it was precisely on the top of this needle that the peach fell. You see there? The peach has fallen on top of it. There was a squelch. The needle went in deep, and suddenly there was the giant peach caught and spiked up on the very pinnacle of the Empire State Building. Chapter 37. It was really an amazing sight, and in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as the people below realised that this now couldn't possibly be a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subway to gawp at the marvel. The streets for half a mile around the building were jammed with men and women, and when the word spread that there were actually living things moving around on top of the great round ball, everyone went wild with excitement. "It's a flying saucer!" they shouted. "They're from outer space! They're men from Mars! Or maybe they came from the moon!" And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his eyes said, "They look pretty peculiar to me, I'll tell you that." Police cars and fire engines came screaming from all over the city and pulled up outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 police swarmed into the building and went up the elevators as high as they could go. Then they poured out onto the observation room, which is the place where tourists stand just at the bottom of the spike. All the policemen were holding their guns at the ready and their fingers on the trigger, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets. But from where they stood, almost directly under the peach, they couldn't actually see the travellers up on the top. "Ahoy there!" shouted the chief of police. "Come out and show yourselves!" Suddenly the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the peach. His black eyes, as large and round as 2 marbles, glared down at the policemen and the firemen below. Then his monstrous ugly face broke into a wide grin. The policemen and the firemen all started shouting at once. "Look out!" they cried. "It's a dragon! It's not a dragon, it's a wampus! It's a gorgon! It's a sea serpent! It's a proc! It's a manticore!" 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away. "It's a snozwanger!" cried the chief of police. "It's a wangdoodle!" yelled the head of the fire department. The centipede kept on grinning. He seemed to be enjoying enormously the commotion that he was causing. "Now see here," shouted the chief of police. "You listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you've come from." "We've come thousands of miles away," the centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever and showing his brown teeth. "There you are," called the chief of police. "I told you they came from Mars." "I guess you're right," said the head of the fire department. At that point, the old green grasshopper poked his huge green head over the side of the peach alongside the centipedes. 6 more big strong men fainted when they saw him. "That's one's an oink!" screamed the head of the fire department. "I just know it's an oink." "Or a cockatrice," yelled the chief of police. "Stand back, men. It may jump down on us at any moment." "What on earth are you talking about?" the old green grasshopper said to the centipede. "Search me," the centipede answered, "but they seem to be in an awful stew about something." Then Miss Spider's large, black, murderous-looking head, which to a stranger was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshoppers. "Snakes and ladders!" yelled the head of the fire department. "We are finished now. It's a giant scorpula." "It's worse than that," cried the chief of police. "It's a vermicious knid. Oh, just look at its vermicious, gruesome face." "Is that the kind that eats fully grown men for breakfast?" the head of the fire department asked, going white as a sheet. "I'm afraid it is," the chief of police answered. "Oh, please, why doesn't someone help us to get down from here?" Miss Spider called out. "It's making me giddy." "This could be a trick," said the head of the fire department. "Don't anyone make a move until I say." "They probably got space guns," muttered the chief of police. "But we've got to do something," the head of the fire department announced grimly. "About 5 million people are standing down there in those streets watching us." "Then why don't you put up a ladder?" the chief of police asked him. "I'll stand at the bottom and hold it steady for you while you go up and see what's happening." "Thanks very much," snapped the head of the fire department. Soon there were no less than 7 large, fantastic faces peering over the side of the peach. The centipedes, the old green grasshoppers, Miss Spiders, the earthworms, the ladybirds, the silkworms, and the glowworms. And sort of panic was beginning to break out among the firemen and the policemen on the roof. Then all at once the panic stopped and a great gasp of astonishment went all around, for now a small boy was seen to be standing up there beside the creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out, "Hello, everybody! Hello!" For a few moments the men below just stood and stared and gaped. They simply couldn't believe their eyes. "Bless my soul!" cried the head of the police department, going red in the face. "It really is a little boy, isn't it?" "Don't be frightened of us, please," James called out. "We're so glad to be here." "What about those others beside you? Are any of them dangerous?" "Of course they're not dangerous," James answered. "They're the nicest creatures in the world. Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'm sure you will believe me. My friends, this is Centipede, and let me make it known, he is so sweet and gentle that, although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone. When nurse is off and all the royal children are alone, small wonder, said a fireman, they're no longer on the throne. The earthworm, on the other hand, said James, beginning to expand, is great for digging up the land and making old soils newer. Moreover, you should understand he would be absolutely grand for digging some subway tunnels and for making you a sewer. The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried. Could any words be truer? And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, is a boon in millions and millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays and he plays and he plays. As a toy for your children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You've only to tickle the soles of his feet, and he hops and he hops and he hops. He can't be very fierce, exclaimed the head of all the cops. And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She is easy to install on your ceiling or your wall. And although this smacks a bit of eccentricity, it's really rather clever, for thereafter you will never have the slightest need for using electricity. At which no less than 52 policemen cried, if this is true, that creature'll get some Fabulous publicity. And here we have Miss Spider with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested to me to say that she's never met Miss Moffat on her charming little tuffet. If she had, she'd not have frightened her away. Should her looks sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it would harm you to repeat at least 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider. I must only help and guide her, and invite her to the nursery to play. The police all nodded slightly, and the fireman smiled politely, and about a dozen people cried, hooray! And there's my darling ladybird, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She has 400 children, and she's left them all behind, but they're coming on the next peach, if they can. The cops cried, she's entrancing, all the firemen started dancing, and the crowds all started cheering to a man. And now the silkworm, James went on, whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia, if you would search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu. I don't think you would find one bit of silk that could compare with it. Even the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff, and what is more, the silkworm had, I'll have you know, the honour not so long ago to spin and weave and sew and press the Queen of England's wedding dress, and she's already made and sent a waistcoat for your president. Well, good for her, the cops cried out, and all at once a mighty shout went up around the Empire State. Let's get them down at once. Why wait? Chapter 38. 5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials, and suddenly everyone who had come over on the peach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of the City Hall, where the Mayor of New York made a speech of welcome, and while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks, armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys, swarmed up to the top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant peach off the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the Mayor shouted, "We must now have a ticker-tape parade for our wonderful visitors." And so a procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, sat James and all of his friends. Next came the giant peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto a large truck, and there it now sat, looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom of it where the spike of the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that, or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping out onto the street? Behind the peach, skidding about all over the place in the peach juice, came the Mayor's limousine, and behind the Mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They lined the streets and they leaned out of the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and ticker tape. And James and his friends stood by in the car and waved back at them as they went. Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James, could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvellous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. It won't keep forever anyway." No sooner had he said this, about 50 other children exploded from the crowd and came running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up onto the truck and swarmed like ants over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what happened spread quickly from the street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children, a mile long, chasing after the peach as it proceeded slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamelin had suddenly descended upon New York, and to James, who had never dreamt that there could be so many children as this in the world, it was the most marvellous thing that he'd ever seen. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the truck. Chapter 39. And thus the journey ended, but the travellers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The Centipede was made vice president in charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The earthworm with his lovely pink skin was employed by a company that made women's face creams to speak commercials on television. The silkworm and Miss Spider, after they had both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The glowworm became the light inside the torch on the Statue of Liberty and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electric bill every year. The old green grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. And the ladybird, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honour in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a monument, it was a famous house. And inside the famous house there lived a famous person. James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock up on the door, and the door would always be open to you, and you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had first met his friends. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you would find the old green grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire. Or perhaps it would be Ladybird, who had dropped in for a cup of tea and a gossip, or the centipede to show off a new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvellous peach stone in the park, and James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest little boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell and tell again the story of his adventures of the peach, he thought he would write it. He would be nice if he sat down and wrote it as a book. So he did. And that is what you have just finished reading. And that's it. That's the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed it.